Good morning and welcome everyone to the first session of our second day of the HACR Annual Symposium, The Power of Hispanic Inclusion. My name is Andrea Orlando and I am the Encore Fellow for Communications here at the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. In this session, you will hear about proven DE&I methods and how to use the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index report to support diversity progress at your company. I would like to start out the session with a video from our co-host sponsor, Pepsico. Please enjoy this short video.
At Pepsico, we're proud to be part of the Latino community. It's vibrant, passionate, resilient, and always moving forward, even in the face of hardship. We know this because, like you, we live and work here. We see the energy, the smiles, and the drive of our people. That's why we've partnered with Unidos US to support nearly 300 local community organizations. We'll provide meals for seniors and families in need, helping them get the medical care they seek, and do our part to ensure our community thrives. Because it's about people. It's about our community. It's about all of us. Together is how we get through this.
Thank you, Pepsico, for your continued Hispanic inclusion efforts and for being a part of and proud partner of HACR. And now I would like to introduce you to HACR's Data Analytics Manager, Alida Minkel, to present this year's Corporate Inclusion Index findings. Welcome, Alida.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of some data. Okay, well, welcome. My name is Alida Minkel. I am the Data Analytics Manager here at HACR. I specifically work on the HACR Research team, or better known as the HACR Research Institute, or HRI. So what is the HRI and what do we do? In short, we produce research-based insights that impact change in how companies work with and invest in the Hispanic community. We focus on publishing research on the state of the Hispanic community in corporate America, specifically focusing on the 4 areas of economic reciprocity, employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance. Our big flagship report, however, though, is the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index, or CII. For short, the HACR CII is an annual survey that asks qualitative and quantitative questions about companies' inclusion diversity efforts in the 4 areas of employment, procurement, philanthropy, and governance. And any company that is interested in engaging in a dialogue around diversity and inclusion metrics in order to improve their practices and outcomes can participate. This year, we had 92 participating companies. So we like to kind of think of the HACR CII as a roadmap or an annual physical, as we like to refer to it sometimes, where companies can better understand where they are with their DE&I practices and policies, and what the needs of their organization are in those 4 areas. So the theme of this year's report is Hispanic diversity, equity, and inclusion during crisis. For this session, I'm just going to go into kind of like a brief overview of the trends and highlights that we noticed across those 4 areas. So we're going to start with the employment pillar. So this year, the overall rating for participating companies in this area was 4 stars. I will first note that the slight Hispanic employee percentage increase that we see here is due mostly to a decrease in the total number of employees, though the Hispanic employee numbers did decrease as well. This year's outcomes indicate that there are opportunities around tracking outcome metrics in this area, especially around tracking goals and metrics related to sponsorship. So although 70% of companies had structured sponsorship programs, only 57% had goals and metrics for their sponsorship program. So poorly performing programs like this could be hindering progress and during times of difficulty and hardship, have a negative effect on the Hispanic pipeline to leadership positions. Employment is the backbone of the talent, development pipeline, and it lays the foundation for leadership down the road. And so this is why, it will be important for the recovery effort for companies to focus on their practices and outcomes in this particular area. And, in a lot of our research, we emphasize the importance of tracking. After all, that phrase, we heard it multiple times yesterday, what gets measured gets done. But, it's not all doom and gloom in this pillar. This year, participants actually did improve their tracking practices in several areas, including in tracking Hispanic voluntary and involuntary turnover. Another interesting highlight is the increase in the percent of companies that reported they had a diversity recruitment strategy inclusive of Hispanics. So 98% of participating companies indicated that they did, which is great work. That's a big increase from the previous year, which was at 89%. I will note that although continued improvements in this area may help stave off the negative effects of 2020 experienced by the Hispanic talent pipeline, we're a holistic strategy incorporating the needs of the organization in all areas would serve both, Hispanic employees and companies much better. So that's to say, it will help ensure that during times of crisis or uncertainty, diversity and inclusion doesn't, fall to the wayside or stagnate. So I want to make sure that I highlight that, this year we introduced a set of questions to our participating companies in an attempt to, better understand the impact of 2020 on their organization. So participants were asked to consider the events of 2020. So everything from, natural and environmental disasters to the global pandemic to social justice issues, et cetera, and how they may have positively or negatively affected their organization. So in the employment section, we asked more of these questions than in any other section. And the responses particularly stood out from those in the other section. So overall, companies seem to have increased access to resources in order to make the shift to virtual workspaces. You will notice that there were no reported declines in any of the areas we asked about in this section, which is great, but that is something that will not remain true for the other focus areas this year. So let's talk procurement. Procurement is one of the areas we've seen companies struggle the most over the years, and last year was no different. This year, the overall rating for participating companies in this area was 3 stars. I would like to make sure I note that it's not because companies aren't doing great work in this area. A lot of companies are, but because, again, tracking remains a major area of opportunity here. And companies could make improvements to their supplier diversity practices by continuing to develop and track outcomes for Hispanic suppliers. They could also improve outcomes around diverse supplier recruitment, specifically by leveraging the expertise and networks of their employee resource groups. And I really want to highlight that because this year we saw a big drop in the amount of companies leveraging their ERGs across the board for diversity inclusion practices, period, but especially in procurement. But again, don't want to be all doom and gloom. Companies, were more willing to share information on their spend with Hispanic suppliers, and that's led to a more accurate representation of their potential impact on Hispanic businesses at the tier 2 level. You can see a big percentage jump in this area, going from 0.33% to 4.67%. That is a big jump from year to year. I know it doesn't seem like a very high percentage, but for in 1 year, that is a big jump. So improved tracking in areas like tier 2 spend will lead to improved reporting on the contributions and impact of Hispanic suppliers on participating, companies' supply chains. But overall, there was a lot of stagnation in the area of supplier diversity, with companies experiencing fewer changes in their procurement practices due to the events of 2020 than they did in any of the other sections. Generally speaking, companies either experienced no change or increased their efforts in this area. But it's hard to know for certain since, many companies don't share complete data in this pillar. Again, a lot of the information, is, again, difficult to track, but also proprietary. I will note, however, when asked about spending with diverse suppliers in 2020, you can see there on that second one from the bottom, that 46% of participants said they had increased their spending, which is a finding that aligns, with the public discussions and reporting on increased outreach to diverse suppliers. So let's talk about, philanthropy, one of my favorite pillars. So like procurement, philanthropy is one of the areas we've seen companies struggle with the most over the years. This is even before the pandemic. And, this year it was especially difficult. So this year, the overall rating for participating companies was 3 stars. Again, this is because it's very difficult to track impact in this area. This year's outcomes showed that, companies really need to increase their focus on tracking outcomes and performing impact evaluations for their philanthropic investments in the Hispanic community. And, to maximize the efforts of leaders and other stakeholders, companies and communities need to be well informed about the impact of these initiatives. And, there seems to be a decrease in practices that track the impact of philanthropic activities with individual communities. And this is a trend that will not be, conducive to, equitable recovery in the years to come. It's important for companies to understand, the community and their needs, and they can't do this, without tracking. And then, during times of, crisis, it becomes especially important to know how philanthropic efforts are or are not, affecting communities. Are there communities that need more? Do certain communities need something different? You don't know if you don't track. And that level of knowledge will allow for all parties to make adjustments to programmatic delivery to better serve their efforts. Also, in these areas, you can see that, there are areas which have historically been high and yet still this year experienced a decrease. So what this tells us is that companies are doing well providing structured support for these volunteer programs. But I think it's important to highlight the risk of allowing them to continue on a downward trajectory, especially as we think about post-COVID recovery and who is or isn't benefiting from philanthropic giving initiatives. So to kind of summarize for this philanthropy pillar, companies generally had the same philanthropic budgetary resources generally that they had in 2019. And yet, as shown in, the previous slides, there's tracking in this area declined significantly. So a lot of, philanthropic giving, but without tracking where that's going or the impact. So let's talk about our final pillar, governance. So governance tends to be the most straightforward of all of our pillars, though also, as you can see here, has very small percentages. So this year, the overall rating for participating companies in this area was 4 stars. As you can see, Hispanic representation among board members and executives remains incredibly low, though I will note that the percentage of Hispanic corporate executives actually remains steady this year at 4%, which was the same as it was in 2019. And, the lack of representation is just, yet another sign that there are issues with the leadership development pipeline in corporate America for Hispanics. Companies need to continue tracking and reporting on data to help provide an accurate diagnosis. And as corporations prepare to take, their stakeholders, customers, and communities through recovery, it will be important to consider the role that diversity of thought will play in ensuring that the benefits of recovery are equitable. But generally speaking, companies are showing signs of improvement when it comes to their governance practices. And hopefully this will lead to a more inclusive environment for Hispanic leaders. But that being said, more needs to be done to translate these practices to inclusive outcomes, right? So specifically, representation needs to be more intersectional. So partnering with external organizations, like HACR, shameless plug, can help turn these practices into outcomes that can withstand crisis. So that is a very brief summary of our CII findings, kind of the top view of our CII findings. But if you have any questions, shoot us an email at research@hacr.org. And also be sure to download the report that was just released today. A link to that will be put in the chat. But thank you, and I will hand it over to Sid Wilson, our moderator for this session.
So thank you, Alita Minkel, for a great presentation on our HACR 2021 Corporate Inclusion Index, which we just released today. And we certainly hope that the aggregate information was informative. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to have a chat with two leaders from two companies that performed very well in our HACR Corporate Inclusion Index. We're going to be focusing on the employment and procurement pillars of the HACR CII. And so I certainly want to introduce them, starting with Claudia Gilles. She is the vice president at Intel. Thank you for joining us, Claudia. And also Juan Otero, who is the senior vice president at Comcast NBC Universal. Thank you, Juan, for joining us. So please welcome them to our virtual stage.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's start. I want to first start with the governance pillar, and then I want to pivot over to employment, because both Intel and Comcast did very well. You consistently do very well in our survey every year, and so we certainly thank you for not only for your performance in our HACR Corporate Inclusion Index, but also your commitment to to measuring each year how you're doing. Because as Alita mentioned, I think what gets measured gets done. But let's talk about governance first, because hey, Claudia, I'll start with you because Intel has a very structured governance practice between how your CEO engages with the board of directors, and also how you engage even with your internal diversity advisory committee. Can you talk a little about how about that uniqueness about the governance structure at Intel?
Yes. So thank you for having me, and excited to be here and representing Intel. So it's we have this diversity executive committee, which our CEO is part, and as part of that, we have executives representing across our organization. And this group is the group that will be meeting both focus internal and external. And this group also meets with our board on a quarterly basis and reports on the results. As you said, what we get tracked, what gets measured, gets tracked, gets accomplished. So Intel has the RISE goals, which we have goals set up for 2030. And so we got the opportunity through this committee and this structure to review that internally. Has sponsorship all across our executives, and also with the board.
Great, thank you so much. Juan, Comcast, again, is a company for many years, has had a real structured governance practice, between having diversity on the boards, your internal and external, diversity councils. Can you talk a little about, how Comcast thinks about its diversity and inclusion from that governance perspective?
Sure, and thank you, Sid. And I want to thank you for your leadership and HACR's leadership as well. It makes all of our jobs collectively easier having a great partner like you. And working with HACR, it keeps us honest. It keeps us all aligned, and we're big supporters of doing these kinds of surveys because I think that transparency is critical to all of our collective work. That being said, if you were going to ask me how to describe our governance, I would say at this moment, evolving. We've had a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion since the company's formed, but really formally, when I think about about 10 years ago when we started to put some intellectual rigor and accountability with some of the things you mentioned, Sid, about sort of our external diversity committee, our degree to which we were leaning in from a corporate side, making sure that we had alignment around all of the pillars, which we shamelessly stole from HACR in terms of how we govern ourselves, because it was frankly the best model, looking at procurement, community impact, and so forth. So, for a huge period of time, it really was at the corporate level where we were measuring, where we do have all the data analytics, where we really were looking at workforce procurement, community impact, and that governance, is sort of shorthand of the models that we use to tether all of those things together and build accountability, either through public reporting or through goals or through challenges in the procurement space and partners that we work with. I mean, fast forward to, maybe I should say go back a year and a half. I think the different piece for us in terms of equity, when the world, frankly, we went from D&I to DE&I. I think the change in our governance model is so influenced by that E. For us, it's looking at what equity actually means, and that's about outcomes. And I think as we've looked at governance and how that touches all the other things that we've discussed, what are the outcomes we are trying to get to? And if they are not aligning with what the company we want to be, then we need to revisit all of that. Hence my long-winded way of saying that I'll stop where I started. It's evolving. I think as a lot of companies have to do, to take a look at what are those outcomes and are you meeting the benchmarks for yourself, not now, but 10 years from now as well.
Well, great. Thank you, Juan. One question I want to follow up on the governance side is that both your companies certainly are examples of seeing a lot of C-suite engagement when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Can you both talk about how that helps to create that culture of inclusion, that culture of belonging, when you are seeing that level of C-suite engagement, including your CEOs, in really promoting that culture of inclusion? Why don't I start with you, Juan, and then I'll go to you, Claudia, second.
Yeah, I mean, it's a truism. The CEO sets the tenor for the company. Again, I'll go back to a year and a half ago when Brian Roberts put out his mandate of looking at structural racism. What could we do better? What can we do more? And looking at that across Black, Brown, LGBTQ, et cetera, in the broadest swath possible, putting forth a mandate at all levels of the company. And while Brian and his direct reports and my boss, the CDO, are intimately involved in sort of driving the big picture, the interesting thing that's happened, I say, and I've seen this in a lot of companies, is that there's almost been, with that driving from the board CEO, democratization, I guess. No, that's a word. The process has become a whole lot more democratic in the sense we're seeing now the leveling of diversity committees at all levels in the company, and other leaders are division presidents and down, VPs, everyone taking a piece of ownership. I think that all comes from Brian's visibility and his sort of moral call to all of us that we need to figure out how we can do better. So it's critical to have to have your CDO. It's essential to have your leadership team leaning in on this, because it just sends the right message and everybody follows suit because they set the culture of the company.
Great, thank you. Claudia.
Yeah, I want to add to that. It's wonderful to hear. At Intel, we have a new CEO. So we have a new CEO, and one way that I can share that I think that I'm pretty proud of how he's listening in internally. So he, as soon as he came, so at Intel we have a lot of ERGs, like over 20% of our employees that are directly involved in our ERGs, and so. He took the time to listen and really understand. So at Intel, we want to create a world-changing technology that enriches the life of everyone on Earth. And so representing those communities, the way we design our products, the way we create our technology, it's really important understanding from inside and listening to our ERGs. So Pat, he spent time. So one of the groups that he prioritized, it was our Latinx ERG, and spending time with the technologists, understanding from their perspective our pipeline, the impact of leadership parity, and our impact in technology, not only internally but in the society. But I think it's important him leaning in externally through the governance and the metrics that we do internally, but also listening in and having this conversation and making our ERGs an important part of the conversation as well.
Great, thank you. That's great. And again, our thanks for both Intel and Comcast in terms of the governance pillar, and for just your outstanding 5-star scores. So thank you. Let's shift over to employment, another important pillar. And let me start with the what you're doing to to create that level of employee engagement, whether it's through your employee resource groups or how you promote a culture, a sense of belonging at your companies. Can you talk about that culture that's created? How does and maybe we'll start with your employee resource groups and how that helps to foster a great culture of inclusion. We'll start with you, Claudia. We'll go to Juan.
Yeah, so as you said, the ERGs, I personally believe it for all levels of the company, it makes a lot of difference. So that's a big part of our culture of inclusion. We have at Intel, we have been for years now doing an employee survey where we check the employee experience on inclusion. And then where we're talking and listening to the different levels of the organization is hearing how we are solving problems internally, how people were felt, how people feel, how they're respected and treated, but also how the communication happens across the organization, and how your diverse background makes you feel you fit and accepted. And those start a conversation. So we track and we measure that, and we try to see the experiences, how to compare for our diverse community and for our overall community as well. So those are some examples engaging through the ERGs and through the employee experience across as well.
Great, thank you. Juan, can you talk about the ERG system at Comcast, NBC Universal, and how that has helped to foster a culture of inclusion for Hispanics and Latinos at Comcast, NBC Universal?
Yeah, absolutely. Like my friend from Intel, it's something that we've been doing for some time now, and it's our most dedicated employees. It is the folks who, when we do our Your Voice, which is our version of a survey that that it is done yearly, but we also do monthly pulse checks in terms of surveys. It's the way we get data, and the ERG folks are always over-indexed in terms of being the biggest supporters for the company. That being said, I think this virtual world has been tough, and what we have done is sort of pivot that world just a bit, and been thinking of new inventive ways to be more inclusive and pushing the issues of unifying culture. I know we've had something I'm particularly proud about, which is a speaker series that cuts across the companies, that, you know, whether it's Kendi or whether it's, you know, talking about folks with autism, you know, Hispanic Heritage Month is coming up. We've got authors coming through. You know, how do we touch as many people in a world where folks are kind of fatigued a bit from the life of COVID, keep folks engaged? And we've seen those numbers hold steady in terms of those positive reactions. So I think it's accentuating the positive and then pivoting in a time where I think we've all been very challenged on how to keep our enthusiasm up at certain times. So yeah, I think it's all about accentuating the good work that's been going on for a long time and broadening that net. And last point I will say is to look for really those intersectional pieces of how we bring more groups together, the Black Latino groups. How do we bring together the you know, the disabled community that may be over-indexing with challenges during a pandemic as caregivers and so forth, and how do we overlay that with communities of color? Because we know the index for those numbers are big, and the impacts could be more material. So that's the sort of things that we've been working on, Sid.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to pivot to an area that both your companies do very well, and that's with mentorship and sponsorships. You know, something that's so important, not only as you bring in new employees into your companies, but also how you help them move up the pipeline through you know, programs such as mentorships, and hopefully building that into sponsorships. Can you talk about how you promote mentorship and sponsorship at your companies? And I'll start with you, Juan, and then I'll go with Claudia second.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very, I think it's a very reflective of the company in the sense that you can pretty much pick up the phone and get a meeting with anybody, and it's in terms of mentorship and sponsorship. So there's, you know, we do a lot of work through our ERGs because we've got that mechanism in place in terms of pairing up folks, something we've been doing for a long time. And in terms of sponsorships, really trying to think through what that looks like going forward, Sid. And honestly, I think it's something that our company and other companies are looking at. How do you more formalize that in a way to get even more results? Because again, I want to leverage the assets we have. So while I think we're big, I think we've been successful in both those spots. I think we can do better in those spots as well. Again, it's a culture of inclusion that lends itself to mentorship and sponsorship, and you see it all over the footprint. And I just want to see more of it, in all candor. So,
through some specific goals that we have this inclusive leadership and accountability. We want to drive leadership parity. For that, we have been intentionally been training or hiring managers, and I think that just reinforcing and amplifying this thinking through our culture helps also to reinforce the availability, people volunteering more to sponsor, to mentor. We have formal programs, but as my peer said, through our ERGs, we do a lot of matching and helping with those formal programs and matching and sponsoring employees. But I think that one thing that is a little bit different now that I think it's been helping, we have put initiatives to drive leadership representation all across from all the different groups, and we're training leaders at all level in inclusive practices, both on the hiring, and that I think that that continues to feed the culture of diversity and inclusion, and people, and all when we have all our leaders and all our managers train and thinking about that, it expands beyond the practices to the further engagement through mentorship and sponsorship as well.
Great. That's that's great. And so this is as we know, this is something that's really important. I want to touch more, and Juan, you kind of mentioned this in this, is that given the fact that we've had to evolve in this pandemic and shifting into a virtual in this virtual platform, despite this, it hasn't stopped you from making sure that you're engaging with your employees, even in this structure. Can you both talk about how you've evolved in terms of your employee engagements and during this pandemic, and any other unique things that we want to share that you're doing so well? We'll start with you, Claudia, and then we'll go to Juan.
In our industry, it's very busy. We're fortunate that Intel is investing and we are growing, and so that provides a different dynamic. I know that not all companies are in the same situation, but there was a lot of learning, and I think there was a lot of listening through this and adjusting to this year. I was just talking to our Chief Diversity Officer, Dawn, yesterday, exactly about this topic, where we were reflecting, and she was saying that we are actually really excited with the opportunities. There are a lot of challenges, definitely, but we are really excited about the opportunities that this is bringing, because it's making us think in a different way and open our minds to considering our talent in different locations that we haven't considered before, seeing the way we do work in a different way. So it has not been easy. I think that one of the things that helped through this process is we really lean in to listen to our different communities and how this was impacting them and how we could work and support them. Having the metrics, having the surveys, having the open forums and the listening sessions, I think that helps to shape and reinforce our strategy. But I would pivot to say that we're also seeing this as a great opportunity. So how can we lean in more and deeper and engage and look at differently? How can we bring more diversity to the wonderful people that develop technology inside of Intel, and taking advantage of now there's some boundaries that we had that we're rethinking that and looking in a different way.
Great, thank you, Claudia. Juan, I know you talked a little about that, but can you talk any other innovative ways of how you're keeping engaged to promote diversity and inclusion within Comcast NBC Universal this pandemic period?
Yeah. No, I think that it's trying to figure out that healthy balance of strategic engagement, finding out what really the needs are, to Claudia's point about the degree to which, what are the stress points, and what are the emotional tolls, what's the rigid, what are the schedules that we have to look at for parents, caregivers and so forth. So this all goes into sort of a strategic engagement approach that we've taken. And, I like to say that we've been rigidly flexible with our employees in terms of trying to figure out where they are, where we meet them as this evolves. I think absolutely 100% correct about his point on, there's a real opportunity here to think about remote work and how talent does not have to be tethered. And that old excuse of, well, we just don't have that, we don't have the talent pool here. Well, that's no longer a necessary limiting factor if we can think out of the box. I think the key to this entire, one of the gifts of COVID, if that's even a thing you can say, is that if we can get those key learnings and materialize those in terms of future of work and how we show up, we can bring more diversity. We can hire more Latinos. We can bring more people of color into the workplace without necessarily bringing them to high cost places to live. Folks can stay at home, can rigidly flexible if I have my druthers, but again, evolving subject.
Great. Well, I want to, thank the both of you, not only for your participation, but of course, thank Intel and Comcast, NBC Universal for really staying presente when it comes to the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index. And, we of course, Juan Otero, Senior Vice President at Comcast, and Claudia, he is at Vice President at Intel. And of course, thanks to the 92 companies that participated in our HACR Corporate Inclusion Index this year. And if you haven't taken the survey, we encourage you to take it next year. What gets measured gets done, and we're so thankful for many of you that have participated. Again, thank you to Juan and to Claudia. And with that, I will pass it back to Andrea Orlando, and she will close out our session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sid and Alida from the HACR team. And thanks once again to Claudia and Juan for representing the 5-star companies, Comcast, NBC Universal, and Intel. Be sure you check out the HACR booth in the exhibit hall for more information on the HACR Corporate Inclusion Index. I look forward to seeing all of our 5-star companies at the Corporate Inclusion Index Awards presentation in the afternoon. Now we're going to move to our next session, which is the Chief Procurement Officer Roundtable, which starts in just a few minutes in the auditorium. I'll see you all there.